Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 38 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I produce these episodes so that they will stand alone to the extent possible, meaning I want new listeners to be able to tune in and get something out of them, even if they haven't listened to all the previous episodes. Just know, if you're tuning in for the first time and you feel you don't have enough context, that context can be found in the earlier episodes. Especially for this episode, you may find it helpful to first listen to my previous episode, which is where I covered the necessary background for what I'm going to talk about today. Last time, in episode 37, I covered the post-war division of Germany and the construction of the Berlin Wall. I promised then that I would get to the fall of the Berlin Wall today, and I am going to get to it, sort of, but I'm not going to finish that narrative today. As I sat down to write this episode, I realized it's just too much information to cram into a single episode and still do the subject justice. So this one is going to be a two-parter. Today, I will cover the East German refugee crisis of 1989, which led directly to the events that brought down the wall. This is The End of History, Part 38. What are some political realities that we accept today that future generations might look on and wonder how things ever worked that way? As a lover of history, I often view the world through this lens. How might future historians look back on what is happening today and interpret our time just like we look back at earlier times and try to interpret the world of those who came before us? Might future historians look back and wonder how people today ever tolerated a divided Korea, for instance? Coming from a Western democracy with a certain worldview, I am naturally inclined to assume future generations will judge North Korea more harshly than they judge South Korea, and wonder how such a brutal regime was ever tolerated by civilized people. But this, of course, is projecting my own worldview onto future generations, a worldview they won't necessarily share. There is a tendency, particularly among Western liberal political thinkers, towards something that has come to be known as Whig history, essentially the philosophy that society will always naturally move forward toward greater individual freedom and human rights. These Whig historians look back at the great leaps forward that have been taken in many societies over the last several centuries, and they say that they were inevitable, a natural and inexorable progression of society moving forward. It's a theory of the world that is not too dissimilar from Marxism. The idea that trends and forces are naturally, even scientifically, progressing toward a utopian or quasi-utopian society. This worldview of Whig history is reflected in American political philosopher Francis Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, a book I have mentioned in this podcast before, and whose title is inspired by the same Marxist concept that inspired the title of this series. Fukuyama essentially argued that with the collapse of Soviet-style communism, humanity was progressing toward the end of history, really meaning the end of our political development. Basically, he argued that liberal democracy would be the final form of human government, and would eventually be adopted worldwide since the competing ideology of communism was out of the way. I'm oversimplifying the gist of the book, and I do encourage anyone who is as interested in this as I am to go read the book for yourself. I definitely think Fukuyama was incorrect in his analysis, but he is by no means an idiot, so I don't want to sound like I'm portraying him that way. I do think that his philosophy, at least as he expressed it in 1992, is naive. The great leaps society has made in advancing individual liberty and human rights over the last few centuries are not the inevitable result of uncontrollable trends and forces, but are rather the result of millions of people who had the courage to stand against oppression and pursue freedom, even in the face of dire consequences. Their victory was never inevitable, and it still isn't. I won't inundate you with my opinions on present-day politics, but I do think that recent events around the world have exposed how fragile democracy and freedom actually are. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that liberal democracy, which Fukuyama predicted would inevitably be ascendant, is now on the defensive and is losing ground to what, in my opinion, are much more sinister ideologies. So when we talk about the division of the Korean Peninsula, for instance, it's tempting to think that it will inevitably be reunited on South Korean terms, and that future generations will look back and say that such a development was inevitable, and that the North Korean system was never sustainable. But the truth is, sadly, the opposite is probably just as likely. Future generations may look back at our world through a totalitarian lens and wonder how people in our time ever thought people were capable of ruling themselves. Alternatively, it's probably equally as likely as either outcome that Korea just remains politically divided far into the future. Nothing is inevitable. I was born in 1989. I was alive when the Berlin Wall came down, but just barely. I grew up and came of age in a world where a unified Germany was taken for granted, and the idea of a militarized wall down the middle of Europe was unthinkable. And yet my parents grew up in a world where the things I took for granted were unthinkable. And the idea of Europe without an Iron Curtain down the middle was as far-fetched as the idea of the Kim regime taking over South Korea is today. History is messy and unpredictable. At the start of 1989, the winds of change were blowing elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, but few people believed that the Berlin Wall would come down or communism in East Germany would collapse within a year. Condoleezza Rice, who was a senior national security advisor to U.S. President George H.W. Bush, aka Daddy Bush, who took office in January 1989, recalled that nobody in the administration began to anticipate the possibility of German reunification until the summer of 1989, and did not seriously contemplate that it might happen anytime soon until about 3 weeks before the wall came down. Radical changes were taking place in Poland and Hungary, but few thought that these would affect East Germany as dramatically as they did. At the start of 1989, East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, appeared to be one of the more stable states in the Eastern Bloc, and one of the most stubbornly authoritarian and resistant to change. The General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the East's ruling Communist Party, was Erich Honecker. Honecker was born in 1912 in the far western German region of the Saarland. His father was a coal miner and communist political agitator. After the First World War, when the Saarland came under French occupation, Erich followed his father into the family business, joining the Young Communist League of Germany in 1922 at the age of 10. In 1928, Honecker was recruited to attend the Lenin International School in Moscow, a school run by the Soviet regime where they instructed young communists from around the world and trained them to, among other things, foment revolution in their countries. He returned to Germany in 1931 and resumed his party work. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, Honecker openly and vehemently opposed them, first campaigning against the referendum on the Saarland's reincorporation into Germany in January 1935, and after the referendum passed, overwhelmingly, he continued to work as an underground communist agitator, opposing and defying the Nazi regime. In August 1935, he was arrested by the Gestapo and charged with fomenting high treason and, quote, severely falsifying documents, unquote. In other words, he told the truth about the Nazis. He was subsequently sentenced to 10 years in prison and spent the entirety of World War II behind bars in a Nazi prison in Berlin. He was likely spared relocation to a concentration camp because his skills as a roofer were in high demand, especially after the Allied bombing raids over the city intensified in 1943. He spent much of the last 2 years of the war performing forced labor, repairing damage caused by Allied bombs around Berlin. In May 1945, as one of the few senior Communist Party members in Berlin, Honecker was picked up and brought into Walter Ulbricht's group, tasked with instituting communist rule in the Soviet occupation zone. Ulbricht immediately took a liking to the young man, and took him under his wing, becoming something of a mentor to him. In 1955, Ulbricht sent him to continue his studies in Moscow, and Honecker was present at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 when Nikita Khrushchev gave his secret speech denouncing Stalin. Some sources describe Honecker as an unreconstructed Stalinist, but he was probably more sympathetic to Khrushchev's thaw than you might think. Later on, as leader of East Germany, while he was a hardline authoritarian, he did show flexibility when it came to limited economic reform and peaceful coexistence with West Germany. In 1958, Honecker returned to Germany and was elevated to the East German Politburo. He was made the main point man on the Politburo for managing national security issues, and he was therefore responsible for overseeing much of the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. He was also responsible for formulating the hardline policy of shooting those who attempted to defect. Honecker's time in Moscow had allowed him to forge connections with important members of the Soviet Communist Party, and especially after the rise of Leonid Brezhnev, who disliked Ulbricht personally, Honecker was regarded as Moscow's man in East Germany. Increasingly, Honecker became the point of first contact when Moscow communicated with the East German Party, instead of Ulbricht. In 1970, Ulbricht sensed that Honecker was a threat to him and attempted to remove him from his post as party second secretary. But Moscow formally objected and coerced Ulbricht into reinstating Honecker to his former position. By the spring of 1971, having had enough of Ulbricht, Moscow backed a coup to oust Ulbricht from his leadership of the party and voiced support for Honecker to replace him. Once Moscow made their wishes known, the communist parties in the Eastern Bloc states never went against them. It's just not something that happened. So once it was clear that Honecker had the support of Brezhnev, voting out Ulbricht and voting in Honecker was a mere formality. He was elected unanimously by the Central Committee on May 3, 1971. After that, things went pretty smoothly for Honecker for quite some time. His position was secure, and with Moscow behind him, nobody really dared oppose him. One of the more common misconceptions about the period of divided Germany was that the border was impregnable and there was no cooperation between the two Germanys. Ulbricht had accepted the division of Germany as a political reality, but had for the most part refused to cooperate with the West, and refused to recognize their legitimacy. But Erich Honecker saw things differently. He sought not only to accept the existence of West Germany, but to cooperate with them, following Brezhnev's lead in pursuing a policy of détente and signing agreements with Western powers. It was under Honecker's leadership, therefore, that we saw the first cracks start to show in the Iron Curtain. In December 1971, he signed an agreement with West German leadership to allow some limited travel between East and West Germany. West Germans with family in the East would be allowed to visit during specified times, and East German citizens could apply for permits to visit the West for special occasions like weddings or funerals, though the regime of course still reserved the right to refuse such permission. And in 1972, he signed the Basic Treaty with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, wherein the two Germanys, without formally recognizing each other, at least recognized the de facto sovereignty of the other, and established a formal channel for relations. Each country would have a quote-unquote permanent mission in the other, embassies in all but name. This led to East Germany establishing formal diplomatic relations with many other countries around the world, including the United States in 1974. At the dawn of the 1980s, Erich Honecker, despite the brutality of his regime, was widely regarded as the most brilliant statesman in the Eastern Bloc, and he headed what appeared to be one of the most stable governments in the communist world. Anybody who told you that before the decade was out, Honecker would be ousted and the East German regime would collapse would likely have been laughed out of the room. But the problems were there, bubbling just underneath the surface. Though they were governed by a hardline regime, the people of East Germany had more exposure to the capitalist West than anyone else in the communist world. Many East Germans kept in regular contact with friends and family in West Germany, and even those who did not have friends or family in the West had access to West German radio and television broadcasts. Radio in the American sector, or RIAS, was particularly influential. The Stasi initially tried to jam these transmissions, but their close proximity to the broadcasts made it more difficult than it was for the KGB to jam Western broadcasts in the Soviet Union. By the mid-1970s, the Stasi more or less gave up on trying to stop people from listening to Western broadcasts. They didn't legalize it per se, but they made a decision to focus their resources in other areas where they felt they could be more effective. Thus, though listening to Rias and other Western broadcasts was discouraged and technically illegal, it was so widespread that the authorities had no choice but to look the other way. The Berlin Wall had been effective at stopping people from emigrating to the West, but the regime's propaganda efforts to justify the wall were less effective than the wall itself. The wall successfully stopped people from leaving, but it did not stifle people's desire to leave. Most East Germans did not actually want to permanently emigrate. They were as attached to their homeland as any people anywhere at any time. But they also had as much desire to travel and see the world as people in other countries. And those that could travel abroad did. In the context of Cold War Europe, such travel was generally limited to traveling within the Eastern Bloc. With its relative openness and economic prosperity, Hungary was the most popular travel destination for East Germans, and hundreds of thousands of East Germans regularly vacationed in Hungary every year. While Hungary remained a communist ally firmly entrenched in the Eastern Bloc, that was fine. But in 1989, when reformers in Hungary began to reject the communist system and move away from the Eastern Bloc, this presented a huge potential problem for the East German regime. Framed as a financial rather than a political decision at first, in May 1989, Hungary began to dismantle the physical barriers on its border with Austria, with Hungarian Prime Minister Miklos Nemeth claiming the barriers were redundant, as Hungarian citizens were already allowed to freely travel west. I won't revisit the whole timeline of events in Hungary here. I covered that back in episode 36, for anyone who wants to go back and get more details. For now, I'll just say that despite framing it as a financial decision, the evidence is overwhelming that Nemeth was intentionally undermining the communist system in the Eastern Bloc. This was confirmed in August 1989 when he lent his support to a symbolic event on the Hungarian-Austrian border near the Hungarian city of Sopron, called the Pan-European Picnic. The Pan-European Picnic was originally the brainchild of Otto von Habsburg, and was billed as a symbolic celebration of the destruction of the Iron Curtain. Supposedly, the border would be only temporarily and ceremonially opened, before being closed again. However, it was understood by the authorities that some people may take the opportunity to cross the border and emigrate to the west, including many East Germans, and the Hungarian border guards were quietly given instructions to look the other way. Over 600 people, mostly East Germans, crossed the border that day. It was the largest single movement of refugees from East Germany since the construction of the Berlin Wall. Of course, the border was not actually open. Hungary was still a member of the Warsaw Pact and subject to multiple agreements with East Germany not to let their citizens pass through the border, and the Hungarians did not simply toss their relationship with East Germany to the wind. After the events of the picnic were concluded, Hungarian border guards resumed apprehending and turning around East German citizens they caught trying to cross the border without the proper documentation. This did not stop Western media from broadcasting videos and images of East Germans being let through Hungary's border with Austria, however. Many East Germans saw these images on the broadcasts from West Germany that they were able to pick up in their homes. It led many East Germans who were inclined to emigrate to try and seize this opportunity and escape through Hungary. The issue for those who wanted to leave was never whether they would be accepted into West Germany, but whether they would be able to leave the East. West Germany did not consider East Germany to be a foreign country, so therefore any citizen of East Germany was automatically a citizen of the West. South Korea has a similar policy toward North Koreans who are able to escape and reach South Korea today. I often tell my immigration clients who ask me if they can travel abroad that nobody in the US will ever stop them from leaving. The issue is whether or not they will be allowed back in. East Germans in 1989 faced the opposite issue. They knew they would be welcomed in West Germany, but East Germany would not allow them to leave. Hoping to seize the opportunity that the Pan-European Picnic provided, thousands of East Germans flooded into Hungary, hoping to cross the border and reach West Germany through Austria, only to find that the border had once again been closed. At least one East German citizen was killed by a nervous Hungarian border guard as he attempted to cross into Austria without authorization. The story was heavily publicized by East German state media in an effort to discourage emigration. But it didn't work, and people continued to flood into Hungary. Hungary had signed a treaty with East Germany back in the 50s, agreeing to return any East German citizens who attempted to flee through Hungary. However, in response to the Romanian refugee crisis that I discussed back in episode 36, in March 1989, Hungary had signed and ratified the UN Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the UN treaty that defines refugees and prohibits countries from returning refugees to another country where they're likely to face persecution on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. I'm an immigration lawyer here in the US, which is a party to this treaty, and I could talk your ear off for hours about the nuances of the law here, but I won't. If there is enough demand in the future, I may do a supplemental or special episode on this, so let me know in the comments if that's something you all would be interested in. For now, however, I won't get sidetracked from my main narrative. Suffice to say for now that the Hungarian officials argued that their accession to this UN treaty superseded their previous agreements with East Germany and prohibited them from forcibly returning East German refugees. So unable to reach the West, and too afraid to return to East Germany, hundreds of thousands of refugees crowded into Hungary with nowhere to go. Thousands crowded into the West German embassy in Budapest in hopes that they could find some kind of transport to the West from there. By early September, there were an estimated 600,000 East German refugees stranded in Hungary. Hungarian Prime Minister Nemeth was at first unsure how to handle the crisis. He did not want to risk upsetting East Germany or the USSR by opening the border, but he was committed to honoring his country's treaty obligations to refugees. It was West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl who broke the dam and convinced Nemeth to open the border. Nemeth was concerned about upsetting his allies, and above all, he did not want to undermine Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the USSR, which he enthusiastically supported, by seeming to weaken Moscow's global position. But he also was governing a country seeking deeper and deeper into economic crisis, and in a secret meeting on August 25th in Bonn, West Germany, Kohl promised Nemeth that West Germany would help Hungary to obtain the necessary loans and capital investment to salvage its economic situation, in return for following West Germany's lead on the refugee issue. On August 31st, 1989, the Hungarian Foreign Ministry formally informed the governments of the USSR and East Germany that as of September 11th, 1989, their border would be officially open, and that third country nationals, including East Germans, would not be prohibited by Hungarian authorities from exiting the country and entering Austria. Whether they were allowed into Austria, they said, was a matter for Austrian authorities, not Hungarian ones. Austria, of course, was also cooperating with Chancellor Kohl and planned to let the East Germans pass. East German authorities responded on September 18th by closing off travel to Hungary for their citizens. It was too late to stop the flood, however. Rather than simply give up when they were unable to reach Hungary, thousands of East Germans instead made their way to the West German embassy in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, where they were still allowed to freely travel. Czechoslovakia, unlike Hungary, was still governed by relatively hardline communists, and their border with West Germany remained categorically closed, both to their own citizens and to the East Germans. But this didn't stop East Germans from traveling there now that the genie was out of the bottle. The situation at the West German embassy in Prague was growing into a humanitarian crisis, as there simply was not enough space or resources to provide for all of the refugees seeking entry. At the end of that month, a delegation from West Germany met with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, in New York during a meeting of the UN General Assembly, and pleaded with him to exert pressure on East Germany and Czechoslovakia to do something to resolve the situation. Shevardnadze, to his credit, did urge his counterparts in those two countries to take some kind of action to relieve the crisis. The leaders of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party were likewise putting pressure on East Germany to do something, as they were worried that the crisis and the presence of so many East German dissidents within their borders would upset the stability of their own country. Under increasing diplomatic pressure from both the West and his communist allies, Honecker eventually relented, formulating a plan that he believed would allow his regime to save face while also resolving the refugee issue. Rather than allow the refugees to go directly from Prague to West Germany, he would allow them to board sealed trains that would first travel back to East Germany before going on to the West. Upon their return to East Germany, the refugees aboard would be formally expelled from East Germany, thus allowing the government to assert that these people weren't fleeing, but that they were being forcibly expelled as traitors. The whole thing was, frankly, a rather silly charade. Nobody was fooled, and it backfired pretty spectacularly. As these sealed trains, which came to be known colloquially as freedom trains, were still making their way into and through East Germany on October 3rd, Honecker declared that East Germany's borders were officially closed, and he prohibited all travel abroad, including to other Warsaw Pact countries. At this point, East Germany was a bit like a boiling pot of water. The theoretical prospect of escape to the West, or at least temporary travel to another country, allowed the steam to escape and keep the pot from boiling over. But now that the borders were closed, that was like putting the lid on and turning the stove onto the highest setting. Closing the borders confirmed to many East Germans what they already suspected. They were prisoners in their own home. On October 4th, 1989, as several freedom trains made their way through Dresden, crowds came out to meet them. A crowd of approximately 22,000 blocked the Dresden train station and the area immediately surrounding it, demanding to board the trains and leave the country. The Stasi first attempted to turn the trains around and send them back to Czechoslovakia, but the Czechoslovakian authorities refused to allow them to re-enter the country, leaving the East Germans no choice but to send in the police to clear the crowd, resulting in a series of violent clashes between the police and the crowd. An official government report noted that 45 police officers were injured that evening. The report did not include the number of injuries among the demonstrators, but it was almost certainly exponentially higher. It took almost 24 hours before the authorities could move 3 trains through Dresden. The remaining 5 were rerouted through other cities, where they met smaller but equally fierce crowds trying to mob their way on board. It's worth noting as an aside that a young lieutenant colonel stationed at the KGB's small outpost in Dresden was present and witnessed the events of the riot that night. The experience of being present in East Germany during those events doubtlessly had an impact on his worldview and the future course of his career, because he came to see the unrest and collapse of order in East Germany as the result of failure by the Soviet Union to protect its own interests and preserve its empire. The young officer's name was Vladimir Putin. The freedom trains eventually made their way to the West, and Honecker believed the crisis was over, but he failed to grasp the consequences of the Pandora's box that had been opened. A small dissident movement organized in churches and inspired by the nonviolent civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States, which had been holding weekly prayers for peace in Leipzig for years now, planned a march around the central ring road in Leipzig. They were small, and the Stasi had agents on the inside monitoring their every move, so up until this point, they weren't taken as a serious threat. But now, with tensions boiling over, massive crowds were expected to join their planned march on October 9, 1989. Intelligence gathered by the Stasi indicated that as many as 40,000 people may march in opposition to the regime on October 9th. When all was said and done, they actually underestimated that number by nearly half. Honecker issued a standing order that if the demonstrators attempted to push past police barricades that had been set up to block them, the police should open fire on the crowd with live ammunition. Members of the police and security forces warned their friends and families to stay away from the protest, while thousands of mostly young East Germans prepared to defy the regime, come what may. A standoff was inevitable. In the days leading up to the planned protest, organizers prepared their wills and steeled their nerves, hoping they would have the courage to stand firm in their convictions. The tensions were boiling over. Something had to give. In spite of rumors that the government had issued orders to shoot, even as they publicly praised the quote-unquote Chinese approach regarding the massacre at Tiananmen Square, thousands turned out to protest anyway. And I will pick up the narrative here next time. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and you want to support the show, you can help us out by becoming a patron on Patreon. You can find our Patreon page at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. If you like the show and you can afford it, becoming a patron is a great way to show your appreciation. You can also find a link to the Patreon on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to the show's social media and streaming platforms, as well as a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you're listening on Spotify, you can also leave a comment directly on this episode. Your feedback is always greatly appreciated. Tell me what you think of the episode, ask a question. You can even tell me I'm wrong or correct a mistake. I do make them from time to time. More activity helps to elevate the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so it's a great way to help me out. Speaking of which, don't forget to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on the podcast platform you're listening on. Next time, on the History Sphere, I will complete my 2-part narrative on the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.